Welcome to the kickoff of the library's 2020 lecture season. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events. Last May, when a metallic blue envelope landed on my desk containing a slip-cased ultramarine galley by Liz Moore that was striped with the quotes from best-selling writers like Dennis Lehane and Paula Hawkins, it was clear that the good people at Riverhead thought they had a big book on their hands. And as we know now, they did, and we do. It's a pleasure to welcome Liz back. It's been 7 years since her last appearance here, when she spoke with photographer Jeffrey Stockbridge about their Kensington-related contributions to the Rust Belt Rising Almanac, during an event that telegraphed our gathering this evening. Liz's earlier works include Heft and The Words of Every Song. Her previous book, The Unseen World, was described in the Washington Post as an elegant and ethereal novel about identity and the dawn of artificial intelligence, and a convincing interior portrait of a young woman. That same elegance and convincing interiority carry her new novel, Long Bright River, beyond the typical crime genre fare, as we are caught up in the lives of Mickey and Casey, two sisters on opposite sides of the law, in a Philadelphia neighborhood devastated by the opioid crisis and a string of related murders. Tonight, Liz will be in conversation with Mike Newall, Metro columnist at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and a writer whose big-heartedness and ire on behalf of the little guy is evident in every piece he writes. It's a pleasure to have them here. Please welcome Liz Moore and Mike Newall to the Free Library.
Thank you so much for coming. What a wonderful crowd. It's so nice to be reading here in Philadelphia because this is my first Philadelphia book. And so it feels particularly meaningful to be here and to be surrounded by so many people I know. I'm looking around, seeing many familiar faces, and also people I don't know, which is equally great. Before I have a conversation with Mike Newall, who very graciously agreed to moderate the discussion, I'm going to read just for about 5 minutes from Long Bright River, just to give you a sense of what it's all about. If anyone likes to follow along, this is from page 77. And Andy did a nice job of putting the book in context. The book is, as he said, the story of two sisters. The older one's name is Mickey, and she's a police officer who's patrolling the neighborhood of Kensington. The younger is Casey, who is suffering from addiction and goes missing near the start of the novel. And the book is written in Mickey's first-person voice, and she often flashes back and forth between her present and her past. So this is a section in which Mickey is kind of reflecting on her shared childhood with her sister and how they ended up where they are today. There are some people who ascribe to their suffering the particular cause of a difficult childhood. Casey, for example, one of the last times we spoke, had recently come to the conclusion that her troubles began first with our parents, who abandoned her, and then with G, their grandmother, who, she said, never loved her and may in fact have disliked her. I looked at her, blinking, and said to her as levelly as I could that I grew up in the same household as she did. My implication, of course, was that it is the decisions that I have made in life that have placed me on my specific path. Decisions, not chance. And that although our childhood may not have been idyllic, it sufficiently prepared one of us, at least, for a productive life. But when I said this, Casey only buried her head in her hands and said to me, "It's different, Mickey. Things have always been so different for you." To this day, I don't know what her meaning could have been. In fact, it is possible to argue, I believe, if we were to evaluate who had the more difficult childhood, whatever that may mean, one might find the balance tipped toward me. I say this because, of the two of us, I am the only one with memories of our mother, and very fond ones of that. Therefore, the loss of our mother was difficult for me in a way that it would not have been for Casey, who was too little while our mother was alive to recall her. She was young, our mother, 18 years old at the time of her pregnancy with me. She was a senior in high school, a good student, G always said, a good girl, And she had only been dating our father for a few months when it happened. As the story goes, it took everyone by surprise, and no one more than G, who to this day narrates the shock of the news with urgency and grief. No one believed it, she says. When I told them, they all said, not Lisa. G was just religious enough to make an abortion out of the question. But she was also religious enough to be enraged by the pregnancy, ashamed of it, to see it as something to hide. The year was 1984. G herself had been married at 19 and had had Lisa at 20, but times were different then, G liked to say. G's husband died very young in a car accident. I wonder today if he had been drunk, since G often mentions his drinking, and she never remarried. I used to imagine that things would have gone differently for G if her husband, our grandfather, hadn't died. So much of her life has been governed by the need to simply keep her head above water, to put food on the table, to pay bills, to pay down the debt that she constantly incurs. If she had had a partner in these endeavors, someone to add a paycheck, someone to mourn alongside when her only daughter died, perhaps her life and ours might have been better. But this sort of idle speculation might be pure sentimentality, for to this day, G claims she has no use for men, thinks of them only as obstacles in her path, nuisances who are only occasionally necessary for the propagation of human life. She mistrusts them implicitly, avoids them when possible. And I'm going to stop there.
My name's Mike Newall. I work for the Philadelphia Inquirer, a Metro columnist there, and it's really my pleasure and honor to be here tonight to talk with Liz about a book for a few reasons. One, it's fun to be in front of the hometown crowd with a lot of friends and family. I think Liz is here tonight, so that's really fun. And it's just a really powerful book that writes with authority and power about our city and our neighborhoods and the crisis that we're going through right now. And it's that, and it's also just a really great story that I kind of devoured in a few sittings. And I think that's a really hard balance to pull off. So I guess let me just start with, the book is set in Kensington. It's set in the opioid crisis right now, and it's these are painful waters to dwell in. So what brought you to this book? What brought you to this topic?
So I have been, I guess, working and spending time in and around Kensington since about 2009. I went there as part of a photojournalism project, which Andy mentioned. So I went a handful of times through that. And then I found myself so kind of compelled by the stories of the people I met in Kensington that I couldn't stop thinking about them. And so I found myself going back over and over, eventually doing community work there in a variety of ways, including teaching free writing workshops at a women's day shelter housed within St. Francis Inn, some representatives of which I think might be here tonight. It's a wonderful community, wonderful community organization, long-standing organization in Kensington that I know Mike is familiar with as well. So I think a lot of the kind of research for the book was pretty organic. I was just like spending time in the neighborhood, and anytime a writer of fiction gets around a situation that's very complicated, it's tempting to write fiction about it. And I think Kensington is nothing if not very multifaceted and very complicated. I'm sure, since we're here in Philadelphia, that many of you are either from Kensington, have family members from Kensington, grew up in Kensington, live currently in Kensington. So I say this with a certain amount of trepidation, being also aware of my own permanent outsider status in Kensington. I write about Kensington, but I think probably many of you in this room live Kensington, which is a different thing. And the other source of inspiration for me, again, many people in the country, addiction was sort of a big topic of conversation in my household growing up, being that my family has sort of a multi-generational history of addiction. And so this isn't the first time I've written about it. A book of mine called Heft also dealt a bit with addiction. But that was the other sort of primary source of inspiration for the book.
So you were kind of living with the book for a while. Was there a moment where it clicked for you, where you thought, okay, this is a novel?
So I spend a lot of time like teetering back and forth on whether I want to commit to the writing of a novel-length work. So as I said, my first trips to Kensington were in 2009, and I was writing nonfiction about the neighborhood. I was writing sketches. I eventually wrote a short story that, as I said to you earlier, wasn't particularly successful. Like, it just wasn't working for reasons that I can try to articulate, but they're probably boring. So I put that aside, and I think to answer your question specifically, what makes me think that I have to write a novel is when I can't really write anything else, or when I don't want to write anything else. So eventually I decided this is probably the novel that I want to write. And when I really buckled down to write, it took about like four years or so.
In Kensington, I've done in my work a lot of journalism about Kensington, and it can be a very disorienting place. It's a neighborhood where people are working and living and raising families, but it's a place of just immense public suffering, and kind of the amount of just how vivid and on display the opioid crisis is in that neighborhood is something I really think you can't experience unless you're there. And through it all rumbles the yell overhead. So can you tell me a little bit about what were the people and experiences in that neighborhood that really shaped you and drew you in?
Sure. I think, so for those, I'm sure many of you know Mike's work. Mike has been writing articles, columns about Kensington for longer than I was writing the book. So actually many of his articles served as kind of like research for the book as I was writing it. And if anybody's had a chance to finish the book already, you'll probably, two of his columns in particular, one about, speaking of libraries, the McPherson Square Library, was very inspiring, and another about an abandoned cathedral that the sort of, without giving anything away, toward the end of the book, it's a different version of that cathedral, but a similar cathedral appears in the book. So many of the images of Kensington that I saw in person stuck with me and made me want to try to translate them into words. I guess just from a technical standpoint, it's an interesting exercise for a writer to try to translate the visual into language. And I hope that I was successful at that. In terms of the people that I met, yeah, I mean, I'm still in touch with some of them. I carry around memories of conversations that I've had daily. I think about the people that I met in a variety of capacities in Kensington all the time. I wonder if they will read the book with some trepidation. Yeah, I mean, they really, truly made an impact on me and make an impact on me, and I feel the weight of that responsibility, for sure. Yeah.
I think one of the things that was so enjoyable about the book was, very often people write about Kensington, it is, they do it in kind of a sensationalized way, and because it's, so easy to do that. But I thought you did such a really powerful job kind of just capturing the small beauty of the neighborhood, the small beauties that are on display if you can see past the suffering. Mickey and Casey, the main characters, Mickey, the police officer, and Casey, her sister. Really such complex characters. And as much as this is a book about addiction, it's about how families deal with addiction. And Casey especially is such a complex character in that she's very protective of her sister. She's in that neighborhood patrolling it for a reason. And then without giving away any plot twists, she's also very severely judgmental and kind of has a lot of anger towards her sister, which I think a lot of families that deal with addiction can relate to. My own brother died from a heroin addiction, heroin overdose. So those characters, Mickey, really, I could relate to. Can you tell me how they came to be and what you drew upon in creating them?
I'm really interested in writing. I teach writing too, and some of my students are here. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is in a novel-length work, if your characters are static from start to finish, if they achieve no change, for better or worse, then why has a reader spent that time reading the book? And so I think when we meet Casey, Mickey, when my initial concept of Mickey was as somebody who perceived herself to be correct in all things, morally upright, on the right side of something important in her mind. And the passage that I chose to read tonight, I chose because I think it reflects that to a certain extent. It's this monologue she delivers about, we grew up in the same family, but Casey chose this path and I chose this path, without, I think, much understanding or empathy at the start of the novel. And I think, I've met people, I've crossed paths with people who believe that to a certain extent, and I reserve judgment because I think, people with addiction or people adjacent to people with addiction have a variety of different reactions to addiction, all of which are valid. Now, Mickey's is difficult. She is a problematic character because she believes that she is, as I said, sort of correct. She has this very binary way of thinking. Mike referred to a twist, which I unfortunately cannot talk about, being that the book has been out for 1 week. What I came to understand about Mickey as I wrote her is that she is not as morally upright as she perceives herself to be, and that she's somewhat in denial about some of her own tendencies. And so that, to me, complicates the question of who's right and who's wrong in an interesting way. It's not the person with addiction who's wrong necessarily. It's not the person adjacent to addiction who's right. It's both of them back and forth over and over again, switching places on who's on the right side of the law, who's on the wrong side of the law, who's on the right side of morality, who's on the wrong side of morality. And I think that's sort of what it is to be human, too.
And again, has someone who's been or has dealt with that, and as any good fiction should, it did kind of, the complexities I thought were at the heart of the novel and really kind of force the reader or allow the reader to have those questions and their own experiences. And sadly, probably too many of us, or a lot of us probably have those same type of experiences. Did Mickey, and again, not to give away the plot twist, but it's a really good twist, so read the book and tell your friends. But did Mickey and Casey, did you have that in mind, or did they kind of lead you to that point? Or did they, did you have the story or the characters first?
I always have characters first. I never have any idea of what the story will be. This is the first book I've written that's kind of being categorized as a crime drama. And so as I wrote more and more about it into the book, and I sort of realized, like, wait a second, I have a police officer character. I have somebody who goes missing. I have a string of murders. All of a sudden, I'm like, I think I might be writing a thriller. Then the weight of that kind of settled on my shoulders, and I thought, I love reading thrillers. I love crime drama. I love detective film and television. So I am a great consumer of those things, and I suddenly found myself in the position of wanting to respect the conventions of those genres, while also wanting to leave myself room to upend the conventions of those genres when I felt like it, which I guess I did in some cases. But all the twists were not thought out in advance. They came out of big revelations that I had in the writing, which then caused me to return to the beginning and start over completely several times. They came out of conversations I had with other readers of early drafts, which I have to like give credit where credit's due. That was extremely helpful on like 2 specific occasions. But each time I did have to kind of like go back and say like, wait a second, if that's what happens, then I can't write Mickey in this way. She has to be written in this other way. And so the book was started over again and again and again, which is why it takes me a long time to write books.
Well, 2 things. One, as a consumer of that genre, as you said you are, when will we get to see this on the big screen anytime soon? Or
It was options by 2 different producers who came together to make an offer. And I am attached to write, which is exciting because I really like screenwriting as well. And I've done it a little bit before. So I hope so.
Is that a challenging process to turn the novel into a screenplay?
It is, for me, very satisfying. I actually really like it a lot. It feels more mathematical and kind of like scientific than the writing of the original text does. And it's more about, in fact, in writing the screenplay for this book, it has caused me to think like, why did I not just do that in the book? You know, but it's too late, and the book is 500 pages long. But it's actually quite fun. I really like screenwriting.
Well, and you talked a little bit about kind of the balance of the genres of the book. How hard was it? How did you achieve that balance in writing about such a weighty topic and also wanting to write just a really good page turner? I mean, it seems to be a hard thing to pull off.
It is, and I feel that I felt when I was writing, and I still feel that responsibility acutely. The concept of wanting to write something that would give people enjoyment as they read, because in the end, that's kind of what I want to do as a writer of fiction, but also wanting to be respectful of the world I was writing about and the human suffering that I saw and see, and you know, family members adjacent to it also. If I'm being generous with myself and with all writers of crime drama, I think it is human nature to be drawn into a good story more than to hearing like a diatribe about morality. So perhaps it is easier for readers to engage with a text that tells a good story. It's kind of like an ancient instinct. And in the process of reading that story and feeling drawn in by it, perhaps there will be a shift in the perception of addiction, or at least they'll see a kind of human face or an empathetic face. It puts a human or empathetic face on what can feel like a scary or opaque problem in the news.
Well, writing about a specific neighborhood, right, in your city, writing about a crisis that's ongoing right now, a crisis that we're still really trying to respond to, and where stigma and shame are still kind of affecting our response to that crisis. How do you balance writing about that and then writing, we said Mickey's a really complex character. She's dwelling in a lot of the confusion and anger that people adjacent to addiction do. So how do you balance writing about that and just writing a flawed character who's compelling and at times says things that, you know, might feed into the stigma? I mean, is there a responsibility? Is there a responsibility in fiction writing there?
This is a very kind of current issue in fiction, and one that I think a lot about. And my answer is yes, there is a responsibility that fiction writers bear, even if they're inventing characters, inventing worlds. We still act as kind of like, in some cases, the first imagining of a character within a particular circumstance that readers will encounter. And therefore, I think a lot about that. My hope is that consumers of this book will read the entire book, because I think you're correct that should readers encounter Mickey in her earliest form, they might see somebody with this kind of self-righteous anger about addiction, or a perception that people with addiction have chosen to be so, and never get to the point in the book, I think, where the ground shifts under everybody's feet a little bit. And so, I hope in conversations around the book, enough people who have read it are able to kind of speak to that as well.
I think, having experience sometimes with loss or addiction, we think that kind of empathy equates to understanding. And that's something I had to learn, where it's just such a complex issue. And even though I thought when I started writing about it was, I know this, I'm empathetic with these folks, I really learned how much I didn't know, or maybe how I had some of the misconceptions or myths about addiction and the treatment of it. Was there anything that this process changed for you on how you view it, addiction and people living with it?
Yeah. Let's see, a very specific thing that changed for me over the course of the decade that I was writing this book is I think I just learned more about opioid addiction specifically, and I learned more about the data when it comes to opioid addiction. So I come from a long line of 12-steppers, and oh God, I'm wading into very dangerous territory here. Lots of different, I think whatever works for you, works for you. And I think that working the steps works very well for a lot of people. I also became much more aware of the importance of medication-assisted treatment, MAT, when it comes to opioid addiction specifically, and how people's understanding of themselves in sobriety can be vastly different. And so that's a very specific answer to your question about how my understanding of of this issue changed over the course of the writing.
I think again, and I'm nothing but full of praise, but another strength of the book I thought was that, as you just said, you want a good story is going to bring people along and hopefully deepen their understanding. And we get this portrayal of this, really kind of complex character, but then there is also work through very smoothly, little bits and pieces about treatment and, what fentanyl is, and a safe injection site, and all these really current issues. And I think reading the book kind of provides, in that really gripping story, a kind of shorthand understanding for folks who might not have it. I just finished the book the other day, and one passage in particular has just kind of stayed with me. It's the title line of the book, and at this point, Casey is kind of giving an accounting of the people in her life that she's lost, and it's, like I said, which many of us can probably relate to, it's a really long list, a really long accounting, and she ends it by saying, our mother, all of them children, all of them gone, people with promise, people dependent and depended upon, people loving and beloved, one after another, in a line, in a river, no font and no outlet, a long bright river of departed souls. That's, to me, was one of the most powerful things I've read about Kensington and about the loss and of the opioid crisis. Where did that sentence come from? What's your long bright river, and where did you draw that from?
A lot of people I've spoken to who themselves are in and out of addiction, or their family members are, do this thing of just listing names of people that they've lost, and the list is often staggeringly long, and I thought of that as sort of the quickest way to introduce people who might not be as familiar with this world to the scope of the problem and the severity of trauma and loss that people have experienced. And the idea of a long bright river of departed souls The phrase Long Bright River is actually used a couple of times in the book. It comes from a Tennyson poem, which serves as the epigraph to the book. The poem's called The Lotus Eaters. And the Long Bright River refers alternately to the Delaware River. Of course, Kensington being right next to in its original form, right next to the Delaware River was in my mind. Also to the Long Bright River of a character's vein. And also to this Long Bright River of Souls. And that was sort of retrofitted. I came up with the title and then immediately saw all of these coincidences of meaning, and also realized that the river of names that starts and ends the book has kind of resonance as well. So that's where that came from.
It lands like a punch. I just got told we have a few more minutes, and I wouldn't be I get my Philadelphian card revoked if I didn't talk about how cool it is to see our city in a novel. Philadelphians love to be like, I know that place, that's us. So just, on a fun note, were there places, were there things, I think there's even foods in the book that you were like, I gotta get that in, that's gotta be somewhere.
I don't think I've ever done this, but I have to give a shout out to my husband, who is much more local than I am and was very, very helpful with many of the food selections, the sports references, what else? He's a good storyteller himself. So for the first time, I sort of bounced ideas aloud off him in a way I've never done before. Normally he doesn't read books until they're in galley form. That's how closed off I am. But yeah, he was sort of like my local guide in certain ways. And he would say he's not even local, but he is much more local than I am.
I'm going to give away one plot twist, but since you said you finished the book, I think last year?
The writing of the book was substantially completely.
So Gritty does not make an appearance in the book.
No. I like Gritty a lot. We have a Gritty stuffed animal. Can you call Gritty an animal? A stuffed Gritty that my daughter likes a lot. She has it. That's one of her prized possessions.
And on a powerful note, on a powerful punch. No, we're going to open it up to your questions. But again, it's a really great read, and it's has a Philadelphian and someone who loves the city. It's just really cool to see the city portrayed in a really thoughtful way that makes you not only think about, how we live and how we're dealing with something that is so consequential. So buy the book.
Thank you so much for your questions and your work.
Hi. I actually took a workshop with Liz. She's a great, great teacher. So I like to write too, and I also have addiction in my family, and being very adjacent to it. And there were times, I guess maybe to get me through, I thought, well, I'm just going to keep notes, and if I write about that in the future, maybe to help people or what have you. But then I thought, well, the person who's addicted in my family, I don't know how they would react. Would that be an invasion of privacy? And you had said that you have experience with your family, certain family members, being addicted. Were you concerned about how they, if they would react negatively to what you wrote, or what the line would be with privacy and wanting to help people?
I can safely say that this story is quite removed from anything in my own family, so maybe I should be more concerned than I am, but I'm not. I'll probably hear from somebody after this. I'm not. I felt somewhat liberated as far as that went. My family's history of everyone's looks different, and mine looks different than this. But I totally understand what you're saying, and I've been in that situation with other books. And there's a huge variety of responses that writers have when it comes to what obligation they have to their own family, from everything's on the table, there's a writer in your family, to I feel it that I can't go there. And it's an ongoing conversation I think you have to have with yourself.
Hello, my name is Bernetta Williams, and I work with teenagers at Northlight Community Center.
Oh.
And Yes, your dad invited us, so we're glad to be here.
My dad volunteers there, full disclosure.
But from my background, I went to Temple as a social work student, and just thinking about some of the meeting the people where they are, how comfortable were the people in Kensington just knowing like that you were writing a story?
So, as I said, most of the kind of research for this novel was somewhat organic, meaning that like I spent a lot of time in the neighborhood before I even started writing the story. With specifically the writing workshops that I led, I disclosed to everybody at the Women's Center that I was a novelist and that I was writing a novel and that it was set in Kensington. And I also, of course, made sure to say, like, it is not based on true events, but I want you all to know that. There were no specific qualms about that that I was told, and that's kind of, I guess that's where the limit of my knowledge ends. But it's certainly, it is something that I'm aware of. In a way, it's related to the first question, like what are the ethics of writing about your own family, and then what are the ethics of writing about people to whom you are an outsider, and that's something that I struggled with a lot while writing this book. Yeah.
I've gotten to read a bunch of your books, and this one's definitely a different genre, like you talked about. Mm-hmm. Do you see yourself continuing on this type of genre, or what's next?
Good question. I think about that a lot myself right now, right in this moment. I would say that I'm working on something. I'm always working on something. And I see it as having an element of mystery. Probably it will not be set specifically in the world of police work. So in that sense, it won't be this genre. But every book that I've written, possibly with the exception of the first, which was a collection of short stories, and there's only so much suspense you can have. I've always written like a mystery into my novels, even though the earlier ones weren't categorized as mysteries or thrillers. So I will probably continue on that track. And hopefully, like, readers will come along with me, whatever left turn I end up taking. Thanks.
I have a tiny question off that. I was a police reporter for many years, and reading this novel, you get the police stuff right. What was that research? Did you do ride-alongs?
I did a ride-along in the district adjacent to Kensington, not in Kensington itself. And I also spoke to a couple of different police officers on the phone, one a friend of the family, and one not, like, somebody I met separately. And that was a woman. I actually made sure to speak to a woman who worked in policing as well, because I think that's a very particular experience.
Congratulations on your movie deal. Do you have people in mind, actresses in mind, and did you have?
I asked the same thing.
Mike asked me that. We hung out before this. And I feel nervous. I don't know the rules of LA. I feel like they're going to fire me as screenwriter if I weigh in public. Okay. But I think a lot about how to convince people to cast unknown actors too in these roles. I doubt very much I would be successful in that endeavor, but I think there's a lot of people who maybe are not known actors who could do a really good job.
They're a lot more generous. If I would be top grossing male actor, top grossing female actor.
I do have to say, Jennifer Lawrence did a really good job in Winter's Bone, and she's probably the top grossing female actor. I know she's got the chops. I don't know.
We were introduced to you at the Dora Williams concert and bought your book and loved it, and it brought us back here. You have such a beautiful voice. What do you do with the music talent that you have?
Oh, yes.
This is like I feel like it's a Wonderful Life, or what's A Christmas Carol. It's like my years in Philadelphia are coming back to haunt me right in this one. No, I'm just kidding. That was, how did that even happen? Dar Williams did a tour maybe like, 5 or 7 years ago? I don't know, where she's a folk singer. Many of you might know her, and she wanted writers to open for her, which was a very generous impulse on her part. So I think she or somebody connected to her knew that I was a writer living in Philadelphia, so asked if I would open for her, not knowing that in my college years I was a big folk music fan and played myself in a band. And so I kind of like nerded out before the concert and told her that I really liked her work, and she invited me to sing with her. And I did that, and you were in the audience, and here you are. The answer is I don't really play music much anymore, my one Philadelphia sadness is I really haven't performed out since moving here about a decade ago. I used to play a lot more. But it was too hard. It was like, I was also getting more serious about writing at that time in my life. And I felt like I only had so much creativity, and I better like funnel it in that other direction. But thank you for asking. It's nice to see you.
Life's good when you're too busy writing best-selling novels and screenplays that you can't jam with Dar Williams.
You just mentioned that you spoke to a woman cop, and that was a very particular experience. And I noticed through the book, which I like flew through. I was surprised how quickly I read it. It was that gripping. There's a thread of, and I hope this isn't spoilery, but you bring up issues that are specific to women that I thought were super timely. And very interesting how you sort of wove that through, particularly with how families were raised and work. So if you could talk a little bit about that aspect.
Yeah. Being a woman in a lot of different fields is, of course, its own thing and has its own set of complex problems. So there's that aspect in Mickey's life. I think maybe what you're referring to, if you're trying not to spoil something, is there's also a way in which power is abused systemically, both inside the police department and that certain members of the police department. Oh gosh, this is a spoiler, isn't it? Yeah, you can't do it.
Just stop
Everyone
by saying
else, plug your ears. You and I can have a conversation about this. But yeah, the abuse of power in a variety of ways, in a variety of systems, is present in the book for sure. Thank you.
I'm here with the St. Francis Inn,
Hello.
but also work with Prevention Point and the Catholic Worker Clinic. So my question is, with all your observations and your conversations and time spent and the thought that you've put into this, do you have any insights or advice that you could offer us as a way of being able to serve better?
I would not dare to do that. I would never dare to do that. I just want to thank you for your work in Kensington. I don't have a personal connection to Prevention Point, but Prevention Point is another wonderful organization that serves the neighborhood. I'm sure you're aware of it. Thank you so much for your work and for being here. That really, really is meaningful to me. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, once you're done reading once you fly through the book, spend a few minutes researching organizations like that do such great work on the front lines, and it's very humbling to see it. But thank you. Congratulations on a beautiful book.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you. We really, really appreciate it.